Hello and welcome back to another EDH deck design video. Today I'm going to be going over my Sedris the Traitor King deck. This is kind of a generic deck I'm running for a multiplayer table, like most of my decks. If you have seen my very recent Timurat deck, or Timmy, or whatever, Timurat, this is the same exact deck with blue added. This is still essentially a creature-based, mass permanent-based deck. By adding blue, I have stronger creatures and more shenanigans. We have moved away from Warp World and moved into a different type of shenanigan that makes for more interesting games that also don't take as long to resolve. So, Sedris, some people call him Sedris the Entertainer from the awesome stand-up guy, I miss him, or Sedris, I just call him Sedris. We have a 6 mana costing 5/5 zombie warrior. He is 3 and 1 of each Grixis up here. A lot of people hate the artwork here. This horned hat is kind of really silly looking. It appears on a couple places, like there's the Demon Prince thing, and one of the humans from the Grixis block that summons it, and it's just I guess one of the things from the Grixis shard. Not really fabulous looking in my opinion. But he has a single ability. It just essentially gives all creatures in my graveyard the Unearth ability, which is 2 and a black. Pops the creature from graveyard to battlefield. Creature gains haste. It is exiled at end of turn if it ever leaves play or flickered. Anything else if it is left, like bounced, it is exiled still. Now there are tricks with that, of course, because if you have an exile effect that returns something from exile to play, like Ghostly Flicker, you're meeting the exile requirement, but it is returning to play. So there's a few techie things in the deck. Most Sedris decks, they are usually some kind of reanimation strategy, where there's lots of put stuff in the graveyard kind of tech, like Buried Alive effects, and very few key clutch creatures. Of course, my take is going to be very different. Instead of reanimation strategy, this deck just draws a lot of cards. This deck has been called very much dirtly. The nickname going in one table is, quote-unquote, draw a lot of cards. That is the strategy in this deck. Instead of tutoring things into my graveyard, I'm just draw-deathing myself until I can reanimate something. And to be completely honest, we are going on, what, 3-4 weeks now of playing this deck. Sedris here has had to have been cast once. And that's actually recent. I was actually enjoying the fact that I had never actually needed to cast him. Either I would have died just way too quick to some combo, or my deck's shenanigans were to the point where I didn't actually need him. But of course there's stuff in the deck that helps if I ever do need him, and he is in a fantastic effect there. Now let me go ahead and set him off to the side. Now again, this is a creature-based deck, very much like my Timurat deck, with less chaotic shenanigans, more overwhelming shenanigans, if that makes any sense. I'll have to explain that. There are 40 creatures in this deck, and they are in mana cost order here. So a lot of these are just early dirlies. I need to point out right now that this is, of course, it is coming from a budget brew. I've put very little investment of financially strong or powerful cards in here. There will be strict upgrades, and I'll try to reference those when we get there. But I have these 2 early 2-drop guys that they are great for just destroying an artifact early. Each is a 2-drop that's a 2/1. Pay a red, sack it, destroy an artifact. They're really nifty to recur later if you just need to pop something back. So I just really like those guys. We have Baleful Strix. It's a great 2-drop that just draws you a card. Again, the theme of this deck is just to keep drawing cards. Dreamscape Artist is an old favorite of mine. This is usually something that's really good in reanimation EDH decks that don't run green. It is not card advantage, because you are discarding a card and sacking it. It's literally horror. Every single card in your hand becomes a once-a-turn horror. You discard a card, tap him, sack a land, and you get 2 basic lands into play untapped. The fact they're untapped is really good. Again, this is not card advantage unless you actually need something in your graveyard, which in a pseudo reanimation deck is actually really good. But of course, if you're running green, then this is just not good. Coffin Queen is fantastic. Felden is still in the deck because there's 40 creatures here, and there's a lot of stuff on my graveyard. Same with Dualcaster, it's just a generically good card. Pilgrim's Eye. This deck runs 39 lands. We are making a deck that is functional with the lack of the partial Paris Mulligan. And this deck, out of those 39 lands, 30 of them are basic lands. This is a very highly budget deck. So we have effects like this that are great replacement effects of getting those lands fixed. Again, this is a budget deck. It's a 3-color deck with 30 basic lands, and the non-basics are even budgetier than you'd think. I have to get to the explain because it's really not necessary to have expensive lands in a 3-color EDH deck depending on what the deck's speed and what the deck is trying to do. But Burnished Heart is even better because it's something we will most likely recur. It's a great 2-for-1 and fixes those colors. We have the 3 flesh bag variants. We have the Marauder with his new artwork, the Merciless Executioner, which is the exact reprint, same power type as everything, and the 4-drop variant, which just has +1/+1 on top. It's a whole... Now we have Solemn, which is one of the better cards to get and reanimate a few times because while this deck does tend to just draw a lot of cards, the second thing this deck does is cheats lands into play by ramping somehow. And just reanimating this guy over and over tends to do that. Disciple, it likes to draw cards. Notion Thief, it likes to draw cards. This is a really great troll card. I am thinking about taking it out. One of my friends has an Arjun deck. One of my other tables, someone has an Azami deck. One of my other tables, someone has an Arcanist deck. Having this card main deck kind of feels dickish, but I mean, it's a really good card. Of course, this can backfire if someone has a Consecrated Sphinx, but meh. Agent of Erebos, I don't really care most of the time about my opponent's graveyard. Sometimes I actually want stuff in their graveyards. This may be on the cutting block soon. Archaeomancer, there's the 3 spell variants that get a spell back. This is what blue gives us. So each of these gets me a spell from my graveyard to my hand. I'll show the spell. Most of you will probably figure it out, but I'll show you shortly. And then Mercurial Chemister, looks like Dali. He likes to draw cards. Keranos, Carry, he likes to draw cards. Havengul Lich, this is fantastic. A lot of people are shoehorning this in now that they've also removed rule number 4 from the EDH rule list. I don't really care too much about that. I actually think it's terrible, a lack of flavor now. But I mean, it lets me recast most of my deck. 40 cards on my deck are creatures, including him, so that's easily, by the time he comes out, half of my deck I can cast from my graveyard if it somehow got there. And it's something, of course, you can put a delayed trigger on if he dies. Fun things. There is a Flying Phyrexian Arena. I like to draw cards. There's a Phyrexian Delver. It is essentially a one-shot reanimation, something that's fun to reanimate. If, for example, he is out and I need a specific card from my graveyard, but I don't want it to exile from Unearth, I can just unearth that guy and grab the card I need. Muldrifter likes to draw cards. Sedris is a great tutor. I only have 2 tutors in the deck. It's Sedris and the Runescar Demon. And this one, again, may just off an earlier creature so I can get some reanimation value. Puppeteer Click is a reanimation from an opponent's graveyard. This is really good just to exile something too, and that persist means it can come back and do it again. And of course, this is a 40 creature deck with lots of enter the battlefield triggers. That Deadeye Navigator should definitely be in here. There's no infinite combos or anything with him. I just wanted this for some extra value. But again, this is something that actually can help reset an Unearth effect. Again, Unearth has the clause that if something were to leave play, no matter what, it is exiled, or that in turn the creature is exiled that's unearthed. Now, Flickering it's an exile, but it gives a replacement effect of coming back from exile. And that addition of coming back from exile, it's met the exile requirement of Unearth, but it comes back into play. Arcanist, he likes to draw cards. Kokosho is a great thing to sacrifice or to recur a couple times, just possibly win condition. There's not a lot of big creatures in the deck to actually dictate a win condition, but that's one of them. Massacre Worm tends to just kill things. Inkeyes is really great just to reset some into the battlefield creature that someone won't block. Rexiel, again, this is just a generic filler. It's a generic threat. This usually doesn't last very long because people really don't want him to connect. Sire of Stagnation is a very budget version of the Consecrated Sphinx. This is a new card. It's really fun to play. Again, this is strictly worse than Consecrated Sphinx in many, many ways. It's the same mana. He doesn't have flying. It's got black splash, so you have to have another color. The issue is that the opponents do not have to actually play a land. The reason Sphinx is so good, it's usually a lot harder to kill a Sphinx because you have to get through your untap phase and your draw phase, maybe play some sorcerer speed removal. This guy, people can just not play land. They can just get up, untap, kill it with a sorcerer speed removal, then play land. but it's really funny to exile things off people's decks, and that makes people butthurt. And what's even better is getting a Rite of Replication out and having 6 of these. That's only happened once, and it was a very fun game. Again, draws a lot of cards. Null Spine Dragon. There's not a lot of combat-based stuff in this deck. We are trying to beat down the opponent with card advantage. But this is one thing that we definitely want to have a nice swing and damage on because it helps us fill our graveyard and refill our hand. Sphinx is Factor of Fiction on a flying creature, great to pair with Deadeye. Same thing, gets spells out of the graveyard. We have the 2 primordials here, this one and the graveyard primordial. The theft one wasn't really good enough, but this one is great as also. I like running him because he essentially baits out a board wipe because you're gaining a lot of board presence just from one single card. But again, it's not really a threatening thing. It's 5 Intimidate Power is nice, but it's something I usually use as a baited board wipe effect. Rune Scar is our second tutor in the deck, great with that Deadeye. And the final creature is the Keter Leviathan. A lot of our stuff has enter the battlefield effects. We don't actually have many ways of interacting with the opponents past making them sack creatures. And this naturally has Unearth, but again, I don't have to pay that much to unearth it. This is just a really great creature if you're running clones, because you can stall the board for as long as you can try to keep casting a clone, clone that, bounce everything, recast him, bounce the clone, and loop. But this is just one of our actual only interactive cards of dealing with an opponent. So there's 40 creatures. Let's go through the spells. Not a lot. The reason those 3 creatures that return spells from graveyard to hand is here is because of Ghostly Flicker. This is a very fun thing to do, especially if you have something that enters the battlefield. Let's just assume we have an Archaeomancer out and any of the creatures in our deck that enters the battlefield and does something. One of my favorites to do is just get out Solemn Simulacrum. And right there with these 2 in play, what I can do is I can cast this. This will come into play. I can return a spell from my graveyard to my hand like Ghostly Flicker. And then, assuming I have 2 creatures out, I can continually cast Ghostly Flicker. Ghostly Flicker will target 2 things. It'll go to the graveyard. One of these things will re-enter, and I can target Ghostly Flicker again. And I'll get the inner battlefield trigger off Solemn. So I can then continually ramp for as many 3 manas I have. And that actually gets out of hand very fast because every turn I do that, I'm getting much more. This used to be a lot more broken. That's great English. A lot worse when there was things like Prophet of Kruphix out, and you could do this every single turn. But luckily, I don't know if it's luckily, they've actually just banned Prophet of Kruphix about a week ago. So there's Ghostly Flicker, very powerful card. I have a Gay Crush for Wake the Dead. This is just a great card. Like, it's essentially, assuming you filled your graveyard, and it's 2 black and however many mana you want to spend to rebuy any enter the battlefield triggers on an opponent's combat. The idea behind the card was to have a blocker set up for your opponent's combat. You don't actually even have to care if your opponent's attacking or not. Again, this is important. A lot of people miss this when I show them this card. You can only cast this on an opponent's combat step, even if the opponent is passing through combat. Like they're not attacking, even if they don't even have creatures to attack with, they still have a combat phase. You can always legally cast this card on an opponent's turn before they end their turn. But I mean, in this deck, we're not really using it to have jump blockers. We're using this to rebuy a gratuitous amount of enter the battlefield triggers. And this usually just really screws people over because they almost never see this coming. I really don't know why this card doesn't see more play. We have Forbidden Alchemy because we like to draw cards. We have Factor Fiction and Steam Augury because we like to draw cards. And Necrologia. This is just one of my old faves. This is the same kind of jank shit I'm running in my Bladewing deck. But to go with that Necrologia, we also have Tunnel Vision. So these are the 2 shenanigan cards of the deck. What I will try to do, if I have one of these early, this one I will try to cast as soon as I can before, like assuming the board is clear and I'm at 40 life, I will literally pay 35 life. At the end of my turn, I will draw 35 cards before my discard phase, and I'll discard a third of my deck to my graveyard. I am praying at some point in there I found one of the reanimation spells coming up. If I didn't, I'm kind of screwed. But most of the time, I'm going to hit it. My Bladewing deck, of course, has tutors, so I have a higher chance of, if I don't hit the reanimation spell, I'll just tutor for it. But again, this is a ballsy card. Sometimes you don't want to do that. Of course, there's aggressive decks on the table. You don't want to do that because you'll just get killed way too fast. The second shenanigans card is Tunnel Vision. We are using this to target ourselves and mill ourselves until we hit a reanimation spell. Again, this is a very expensive card. A lot of people see this in combos with like spell crumple, I guess, or random put stuff on the bottom of your deck kind of things and mill an opponent out. We are targeting ourselves so we can mill ourselves creatures to reanimate. Of course, this is chaotic. All too frequently, you'll call like target living death, mill yourself to living death, and it'll be like 2 cards down. 2 weeks ago, I targeted a specific card, and it was the bottom card of my deck, so of course I milled myself out. Less than 24 hours ago, I milled myself till 7 cards were left in my deck, and someone windfalled me. So again, this is a very ballsy card to play. It's never always going to work. But the odds, like just calculated odds, this will generically get approximately half of your deck into your graveyard. You have no idea where the card that you're calling is in your deck. It could be anywhere, but the idea is to get half of your deck in your graveyard. Next turn you will draw this and you can cast it. Another funny story is I did this against another opponent about a week ago, and I was like, man, you don't have Bazooka Bog in your deck. And he said no, he didn't have it in his hand or anything like that. And I went ahead and resolved that, and of course he flashed me a Vampire Tutor. So when this resolved, he just tutored for Bazooka Bog and got me. That was not a fun game. There's not a lot of reanimation in here. There's Living Death and Rise of the Dark Realms are the 2 major spells. If you like these weird shenanigan cards like this, you could of course do things like Patriarch's Bidding. There's other mass reanimation one like, what's the Twilight's Call or something like that? The one that you can pay more to do it in instant speed. It's like the black version of Route. But the last few spells, we have Victimize for a small reanimation, Sack a Thing, get 2 things from graveyard back to play tapped. I just love this card. And Rite of Replication, which is really great. We want to ramp and we want to draw cards. So right-kicking a Solemn, right-kicking a Sire of Stagnation, all the good stuff. And there's not a lot of ramp in this deck, like artifact ramp. We have my 2 favorite 1-drops, which are the Soul Ring and the Wayfarer's Bauble. Then Gem of Becoming is here because, again, I have 39 lands, and only of those, 30 of them are basic lands. There's actually no fetch lands. Again, this is a very budgety deck because the lands are almost all basic. But, I mean, if you're doing a lot of basics, if you can't afford to spend like $100 on lands, and you'd rather just spend like $5 on lands, this is a great inclusion because it fixes your colors. It does get fetch lands. It does get, of course, ABU duels. If you're playing ABU duels and this is in your deck, I think you need to reevaluate your deck. This also does get the new Tango lands, too. And there is Sword of the Animus, because, again, I like ramping in this deck. There's a lot of dirtly creatures. I don't even care if they die in combat. I just want to get the extra land. Crucible is here because, of course, this isn't really budget, I know. But I'm dumping and drawing and draw deathing myself. I'm even sacking my lands to my Dreamscape Artist. And the idea is just to draw until I get the creatures and discard all the junk. So this is great at recurring the lands. There's not fetch lands in this deck, but there's the cheap fetch lands, so it's good with those too. There's Helm of Possession, which is a tide over from Timaret. This is just a generically good card. We don't really have a lot of ways of interacting with the opponents, and this is one of the few ones. Conjurer's Closet, just like the... Oh, I forgot to mention. Where'd it go? So, the Deadeye Navigator, Ghostly Flicker, and Conjurer's Closet. These are the 3 things in the deck that help Sedris return a creature and save it from the graveyard. Because all 3 of those, Deadeye, Conjurer's Closet, Ghostly Flicker, they exile a creature, but they have the return from exile effect tacked on. So, if I were to unearth something with him, and I had one of these effects out, like the Deadeye is the other 3rd one there, I could technically save the creature from being exiled forever. But that's what Conjurer's Closet's here for. This is actually something that's probably not fast enough for what this deck is trying to do. It's just a generically good card. 5 mana to rebuy some earlier used Enter the Battlefield trigger. We have Whip of Erebos. Again, this has a sort of unearth effect, just like Sedris does. So those 3 previously mentioned cards could be used to save the creature permanently. And then we have Phyrexian Arena for drawing cards. I just realized I could probably put a Graveborn Muse in here just to have all 3. That's maybe an inclusion. going on to the lands. Again, there's 39 lands, 30 are basics. We will start with the few. I'm actually really tempted to change this a bit, but the cheapies, we have Command Tower and Crumbling Necropolis, or Necropopulous. These are the two 3-color lands. This is a tap land. Then we have the hyper budget fetch lands for basic lands. This one just gets 2 of the exact same type. This one is probably going to be the first one I cut. It's just I don't really like paying 2 and tap it. It's kind of slow for 1 land. Grixis is on color theme. The other panoramas are pretty good in this style of budget as well. In this particular deck, I didn't have a lot of cards that have 2 or 3 colors requirement, so it's not really necessary. And we have the Evolving Wild and Terramorphic variants. Then we have the old fetch lands that actually can get non-basics. Like these can get shock lands, but these will get me a island or a swamp or a mountain. Then we have lots of basics. We have 11 mountains, or 11 swamps. Then we have 10 islands. And then we have, these are all the shiny foils I had from Onslaught. I had these and these when I used to play Bidding Goblins back in Standard. When I got these back from a friend recently, I actually went and bought a whole bunch of these, about 10 of them exactly. So I have enough for this deck. So 9 mountains, 10 islands, 11 swamps. A lot of basics. Again, in this sort of deck, we're not really doing anything super fast and early. You really don't need a lot of non-basics in not hyper-competitive metas. It's just not necessary, especially if half your dirtly deck is about drawing cards and just ramping with generic shit. Because this is literally, this deck has been called, and the nickname of this deck at the table is Draw a Lot of Cards. If I'm drawing a lot of cards, I don't really care about what lands I have to choose to play, especially if most of my deck, the cards in the deck only require 1 color to cast. I think the only thing that costs 3 consecutive colors is Arcanus. Yeah, that's probably about right. But yeah, this is Sedris the Traitor King. 5/5 zombie warrior. There's usually a lot of themes and gimmicks people go. I mean, reanimation on a dude is pretty strong. Oh, there's no living or buried alive effects or entomb effects in here. There's no combos in here. This is generic good stuff. This deck wins by beating down with sheer card advantage and maybe going off with 2 very shenanigan-y cards. Again, the Tunnel Vision and the Necrologia they are the fun ones. These are not always optimal cards to play. These are really janky in most environments. Of course, you can always hold this up if someone was going to spell crumple a spell. You can get them with that, but this is more for us. And again, this is most likely a dead card past turn 5 or 6, because after you've lost some life, it's just not good. If you're maybe, the best way to run this guy is with Alluro, because you gain a lot of life, gives you a lot of extra room to work with. But yeah, this is Sedris. Any options, feedback, or card requests or anything like that, let me know. If not, have a great